Welcome everybody to this Xaliant and Savient webinar, where we're going to be tackling identity risk in global manufacturing. In doing this, I'm joined by two experts in this area, Jonathan Neal from Savient. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.
And Dave McGrail from Xaliant. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Martin.
What we're going to be doing, hopefully, through this webinar really is giving you a bit of an idea of what the problem specific to manufacturing is, and then we'll start discussing ways we can tackle that. And then hopefully by the end, we'll be able to give you some key takeaways. And one special offer for you all, which we'll mention at the end, which is certainly going to be worth waiting for. A bit of practical help in this space, let's say. So I guess just to give us a general kind of introduction, really, I think we all realize now how important identity is becoming. All the physical barriers and the networking barriers that were provided some protection in the past have now been pulled down with the way we all use communications now, accelerated by COVID, etc. I think everyone gets the challenge of kind of the remote working, certainly. So in all industries, identities become really important. And I think we know that the threat actors know now that, where there are identity problems, it's easier for them to log in than hack in is the kind of common phrase, I guess. There are specific problems in the manufacturing arena. OT is probably one that, operational technology jumps out. And I know a lot of that technology is quite old, so probably never had security in mind when it was even created is a good example. And obviously complex, but nevertheless really important supply chains throw in another challenge there. So with all those kind of identity problems kind of going on, I don't know, Jonathan, do you want to give us some of your experience in this space and things you see in manufacturing that's a real challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Martin. I think you hit some really salient points there around OT was often the sort of forgotten child. It was air-gapped. It was doing very specific functions, certainly in the manufacturing space. But what we've seen now is a real requirement or need to converge IT and OT to get efficiencies, to get better productivity, to be able to remove humans from the loop in terms of manufacturing. We need to be able to better control, certainly who has access to those networks, and of course, what types of devices and machines are running on those networks, and again, who's accessing those. So it actually, while it throws up a lot of net benefits to a manufacturing organization, these things don't come without their own set of unique kind of risks. And I think as we go through this sort of session, we'll be exploring some of those risks and how they impact manufacturing in particular. And obviously some of the things that we can do from a strategic perspective to, first of all, understand the problem. Secondly, is to start putting in place strategies to be able to manage the problem. And obviously then, ensure that we are protected, secure, and obviously compliance is another big area as well. But yeah, certainly a lot of challenges, all driven by a need to reduce costs. Metrics like manufacturing cost per ton are really, really important metrics. And if we can remove some of the barriers to doing business, whether it's supply chain, whether it is semi-dark factories, more automation, more OT devices that are being controlled centrally, then obviously there's significant benefits that can't be ignored in manufacturing.
Yeah. What about yourself, Dave? What do you see?
I think I agree with everything that you both said there. I think globally, and particularly in manufacturing, there's a greater reliance on supply chain and third parties. And there's a requirement for OT to be much more interconnected than it ever has been. And I think that massively increases the attack surface. And so the threat landscape's growing to take advantage of that. As John said, it's really difficult to take some of that old technology and really wrap good controls around it. And the network and security controls work. But ultimately, as we see OT and IT converge, that's where identity becomes increasingly important around that environment. And I think, we can focus on OT, but because also, with that automation, we're seeing more kind of AI in use, but also robotics in picking environments and in manufacturing environments. So much more important there. And I think that interconnectivity is making things, the risk is much increased from that perspective. I think equally as well, because it's been that kind of neglected child, there's so much that isn't known about those environments. They've sort of been off the radar of IT teams and from security teams, as John said, they've been air gapped and ring fenced, and so it's probably a little unfair to call it the Wild West, but perhaps there hasn't been the governance wrapped around it that makes demonstrating compliance easier. So I think there are two lenses to look at this challenge from. One is particularly around the security side of it, but as John started to touch on there's business enablement in managing these environments in a different way. So businesses are very, what's really important for them is operational resilience. So we've seen in the news, and we don't need to name these businesses, but we've seen in the news the impact of supply chain and the knock-on effect that can have, whether it's fuel pipelines in the US, whether it's food manufacturing and logistics and retail, as we've seen in the UK increasingly, and we're now starting to see that impact airlines as well. So supply chain and logistics is everything, and they are massively reliant on these OT environments and these. I guess if we use the new shiny term, the non-human identity side of things, that's driving a lot of that. So I think there's a few things to unpick there. There's the kind of the operational resilience, the OT side of things, the non-human and system identities. So that's the internal side of things with OT. The next side of it is that intersection with external parties and third parties that you need to invite into your organization to help build those relationships, to make those transactions, because ultimately the manufacturing business is far less siloed than it ever used to be. It's far more interconnected and reliant on those third-party relationships, that connectivity and that exchange of information. And that, as I said, that's bringing IT far closer into that OT environment.
Okay, let me just pick up a couple of things there. There's a couple of things we've already landed on, I think. Non-human identities and supply chain, right, which clearly big issues in manufacturing. So let's take non-human identities to start with, because and we'll look at securing them, right? But the first problem might be, how do we identify them, right? So let's include both those. How are we going to identify and secure non-human identities in those plant level environments?
I think one of the biggest challenges it's kind of twofold. First and foremost, machine identities are non-linear. If you look at the sort of general structure, you would have a machine identity that could be linked to multiple machine accounts, that could be linked to multiple credentials, secrets, entitlements, privileges. First and foremost, it's very difficult to discover that. And in fact, what we're seeing more and more prevalent in the market is we're actually turning to AI to help kind of find AI and help find machine identities, because it's a constant kind of battle. One of the key things for machine or non-human identities is there is no HR. There is no HR for onboarding a new machine identity. So the burden kind of falls in IT. And Jensen Huang of NVIDIA even was on stage and said IT will become the HR of non-human identity. And I kind of agree with that. But again, I just wonder if that's going to scale long term. I think ultimately the business itself needs to become the HR for these non-human identities. But what we've got to do is understand the sort of non-linear structure of what creates a non-human identity and all the associated accesses and credentials and privileges. And once we are able to kind of define, to identify those, we can start to look to how do we control. We can start to pivot towards control. How do we vault them? We know traditional techniques for using CMDBs. Gartner's analysis said 75% of CMDBs were failing. So we need a new approach, right? We need to sort of centralize. We need to bring everything together from both human and non-human identities. The second point I was going to make as well, and I actually think it's one of the more difficult ones to crack, is ownership, finding owners for these non-human identities. Because without ownership, you don't have accountability. Without accountability, you can't really pivot towards better control and compliance. So, we'll probably talk a little bit about what does a good scheme look like and what are the maturity steps, but they're two of the sort of key things I think we need to address very quickly in the sort of non-human identity space.
Makes sense. And Dave, maybe some thoughts from you on what are the best practices in some of these areas. Do you have any thoughts on how you deal with things like credential rotation, usage monitoring, audit, all these things?
Yeah, I think there's there's published best practice from various government bodies, and I think the right sizing of controls has to match the right level for the compliance and for the business requirement. So you could go to the end of the earth to try and secure these things, but ultimately you can spend all the money in the world and take as long as you need to over it. But if you take it too far, then you've kind of missed the point. So the aim really is to introduce the governance and appropriate controls without creating friction, without causing issues with the ability to onboard these new identities and build these new connections. And
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I completely agree. Automation is the key, because we already know that machine identities or non-human identities outweigh humans by somewhere in the realms of sort of 45, 50 to 1. With more and more OT devices, IoT things, we're seeing more and more development of agentic applications that are all underpinned by non-human identities. Then this problem is going to get worse and worse, right? Unless we address it, tackle it in a way that means we can scale and we can automate. But you've got to have those foundational controls certainly in place in order to be able to confidently move into a position where you're beginning to more automate and also distribute the ownership and manage that on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I think I saw from Gartner, not long ago, a figure 40 billion plus or machines by 2030, something like that. Massive increase of what was already a big number. So yeah, definitely something we need to be careful of, I guess.
just coming back to those best practices, Martin, I think you mentioned credential rotation. But there are times when that credential when you need a static credential that then needs to be rotated. But the reality is we can move towards a model that's based more around just-in-time provisioning, where it's a credential that's only used once. It's created, in a dynamic way in terms of what's needed at that moment in time. It's enabled and then it's torn down afterwards. And that way you're kind of reducing the ability for that one-time credential to be abused. But as Jonathan said, that relies on a level of automation. It relies on a level of understanding of what those permissions need to be. And as we look at things like agentic AI starting to drive control of these environments, you've got to break the business process into the right number of kind of chunks for different agents to perform different activities. Otherwise, you create a master agent that's got far too much capability, and you've been overly permissive, and that becomes its own attack surface in its own way. So I think, going down that discovery route is fine, but if you spend too long trying to discover everything that's there, there's an argument for looking at what you actually need rather than what's there, and starting again from re-provisioning in a more dynamic way rather than relying on trying to forklift what's old into a newer platform and a newer paradigm.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes sense. And then the second point we got into quite early was third party and external connectivity and the risk associated with that. Give us a bit of a feel, Jonathan, from what you see in that space in recent times.
Well, I think we all are pretty aware that it is a primary attack vector. And similar to sort of OT and machine identities, they were long, historically been a long lost sort of cousin of managing employees. There were semi-manual processes, sort of different silo tools that really kind of weren't doing the job. So it kind of led to more compromise. It led to supply chain credentials being socially engineered, being reused by the wrong actor, etc., to do something. So I think first and foremost, we need to understand the difference between an external identity and an employee. First and foremost, with an employee, when you onboard an employee, there is a level of assurance that's associated with that identity. You've been through an interview process, you've done background checks, you've done criminal record search. They come in on day one, they present their passport, their driving license to, just confirm that they are who they say they are. When you're dealing with externals, you don't have that kind of relationship. So if you look at it realistically, you're starting from a level of assurance of zero. You don't have any kind of proper understanding that these people are who they say they are. And I think the burden was very much with IT for managing these through through a service desk ticket or just manually going and creating these people in Active Directory. But because of legislation like NIS2 in the EU, that kind of game really changed about 3 years ago, and people saw the importance not only of securing their supply chain identities, but also reducing the attack surface, getting better compliance, because being under pressure of increasing regulatory compliance, subject to fines, even criminal charges if they don't put adequate controls in place for managing these, really kind of put supply chain users front and center, and got the attention of the boards that were making decisions on where to spend money, and where to acquire new platforms and new technologies to do that. And then I'll hand to Dave for some comments, but going back exactly to the point he made around a new paradigm of controlling access and controlling the attack surface, we see so many organizations that are also embarking on things like ERP transformations. They're bringing in new technologies that are kind of managing their supply chain, their manufacturing capabilities, but they're bringing more and more externals to take part in those key, critical business processes. Being able to identify where privilege access is required and being able to deliver that just in time at a just enough level, is really what most organizations are looking to achieve, as they go through their maturity of building up the controls around those externals.
Dave, any thoughts from you on that?
I think the third party thing's really interesting. If I bring it back to OT as well, there's a history of OT environments in a manufacturing setting. They're kind of run and maintained by suppliers who put a black box in the environment and go, we'll connect through that box. Mr. Customer, you don't need to worry about giving us firewall access or anything. We'll just use our own internet connection and this little black box that will let us into your environment. That's a really common model. And I think for a period of time, while these environments have been air-gapped, it's been relatively easy from a governance perspective to go, well, that air gap is there, therefore what happens in that space isn't necessarily the business's problem because they're paying somebody else for an outcome. But as I said, as those environments converge, that OT and IT environment converge, that backdoor isn't acceptable from a governance perspective anymore. And so you have to take more control over who's accessing that OT environment. And that necessarily means bringing them in through your IT environment, acknowledging that what the access that you're giving them is privileged, and treating it that way.
Yeah, it's a little bit the crux of what we probably see every day, right? Which is this balance of enablement and security. Someone's found a way to make something easy, but is it secure? So how do organizations, how do some of the manufacturers manage that? How do they get the kind of supply chain collaboration that they want, which is the business enablement piece, alongside that security? What are the practical ways or controls they need to think about in order to do that?
And I would say it's a little bit of carrot and stick. Obviously, some of these things need to be enforced when you're going through your vendor governance processes. you would do your own security assessments. You'll give them a risk score, and we can talk about how that could impact access sort of further down the line if some of these things changes. But we yes, we need to look at this with a security lens, but also from a usability. Now, like I said, historically, a lot of this burden was with IT. This has to move to the business because it has to scale, and it has to move. It has to shift left even more. So what we need to be able to do is, empower our supply chain partners to start being able to onboard, offboard, recertify, request access, for their users, right? With obviously a governance perspective, a level of sponsorship from the organizations, our own people. But we've got to make it faster. We've got to make it easier. We've got to make it simpler. But also we need to ensure that this is secure and this meets our required regulatory mandates as well.
Makes sense. Anything from you, Dave?
Yeah, I think it can be really easy to just get lost in the technology side of this, and we've talked a lot about technology so far in this conversation. Really, the starting point has to, and it comes back to automation. So if you don't work on the people and the business processes first of all, and then use the technology to automate it, you're on a hiding to nothing. Because all automation does is make what's bad worse more quickly. So starting with a mindset of solving this problem isn't just a technology problem. It's, as John said, it's a business challenge in that, there's a hearts and minds, there's a people and process element that needs to be solved for as well. And when you come to approach, a program of transformation with this, that's got to be the starting point where there's an element of discovery, not just around what the identities look like and the technology, but of the business processes and the people that are driving those processes. And only then can you get that full picture and figure out, well, the technology's not where we want it to be, but we need to fix some of the business process first. And that might inform a different view of what technology is required or the way that technology needs to be implemented.
And that's a great point, because really that really kind of articulates to an organization embarking on a transformation, just a view to assess what their level of maturity is. Because like you said, if you don't understand the problem, you don't have ownership and accountability and responsibility, to start to put in place measures. You could use any tool to do a bad job. So yeah, you're completely right, is get these things organized. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the net business benefit that you're trying to achieve? How are you going to measure that? What metrics are you going to apply to that? And then think about how you then improve through technology, through automation, and through other techniques.
It's interesting. Sorry to just add on to that. We talked about kind of compliance and governance a little bit there, and it brings me back to the business enablement thing, right? Because again, it can be easy to get wrapped up in, these kind of transformation programs are pretty sizable, and can be costly, and so there needs to be a business case that extends beyond, well, it's just the cost of doing business, it's cost of being compliant. Ultimately, if you get this right, it can make you easier to do business with. If it's easier to onboard you as a supplier or as a consumer of someone's services, then all of that, pushes you forward in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've got onto that now a little bit, the governance compliance piece. This is something that's grown in all industries, hasn't it, over the last 25 years, I guess. Some of the things we're talking about were a problem for certain regulated industries maybe 20, 25 years ago. It's now coming round to everybody and all sorts of different, in this case, manufacturers. What are your thoughts around how we help out from a compliance governance point of view in the identity space?
I think first and foremost, we should all understand that this burden is only going to get greater, as we move forward. So there's only going to be more regulation. we did some assessments of just the impact of the growth in terms of the numbers of identities from non-human and human and external, plus the growth in new applications, workloads, systems, and platforms that need to come under the umbrella of regulatory compliance. The impact on just something like recertification is huge, because the numbers of line items per quarter or per 6 months that need to be reviewed and recertified is getting bigger and bigger. The net impact to that is the people that have to do these certifications, they don't even understand what they're looking at, right? Let alone being able to spend the time looking at 500, 1,000 individual rows and deciding whether or not, that looks good or that looks bad. And what that leads to is what we call rubber stamping. I'm just going to find the select all and approve all buttons. I'm just going to move forward, because from a compliance perspective, yeah, you're compliant. You ran your certification campaigns, but the revocations was next to zero, very, very sort of low percentage terms. So as a net benefit to the business, both in terms of risk posture management or compliance posture management, is actually pretty close to zero.
Yeah. And what does a kind of, if you're looking at this from a practical perspective, what does a kind of mature identity program look like in manufacturing, and where do people start really?
Well, I think, and Dave can maybe chime in, because he articulated it really well, that it's about hearts and minds, it's about, people and processes. So I think getting the foundations right, getting sort of strong leadership in place, certainly is going to be very beneficial for ensuring, a smooth journey. What I also like to talk to customers about is thinking about what you can do quickly, because these things all rely upon momentum. In order to get and keep momentum, you need to deliver something that's visible and valuable to the business. What have you achieved? How did you achieve it? And what did you deliver in terms of a business value outcome? Because that's going to continue the funding. It's going to continue, the interest in that program. You're going to get more stakeholders wanting to basically come and work with you from different aspects of the business, whether it's the OT environment, whether it's people that are managing supply chain users, right? It's that they will come to you and they'll ask to join this program.
Yeah, business comms is everything. I think if you can make people feel like you're doing something for them and that they're involved in making their lives and jobs easier and safer, rather than having something done to them by the security team, then that's going to be a better outcome.
It is really interesting, because we know, don't we, Dave, at Salient, we get involved in a lot of stressed projects partway through where they've failed to deploy, failed to communicate effectively within the business. That's probably the leading reason that some of these projects get into a bit of a mess.
Not the right business engagement. Absolutely. I think, and if you structure it as John said, if you work towards an MVP and what you've got is incremental value that's shown over time, and if you try and boil the ocean, then you're going to fail. If you don't engage the business in the right way to the right extent, you're going to fail. So it is about starting small, and we've got a colleague, Martin, that says think big and act small, and it is. You've got to, it'd be great to say there's going to be this nirvana, but if you say it's not going to arrive for 5 years, then you'll never get the funding, never mind maintain the funding. So.
Okay, guys, so what do you want people to take away from this discussion?
I think we covered a lot today. We covered a lot of information. The good thing is, right, there are a lot of success stories out there where organizations really have made a significant impact on how they support the business through a transformation program. So there's a good amount of information. There's a good amount of testimonials where customers have embarked on a journey and they've gone through a transformation following some steps. They've matured slowly, but they've delivered quickly. So again, it sounded a bit like bad news at the beginning. It's all negative, but obviously do these things the right way, and you can embrace all of the change, get all of the business benefits, but whilst sort of staying secure and staying compliant.
Brilliant. Dave, anything else from you?
Yeah, it can feel like a bit of a mountain to climb, but I think there's probably 3 key kind of messages and insights that I draw out of what we've talked about. So visibility into the non-human identity side of things. is that foundational step. Take a decision on, if you have a risk-based approach, do you want to spend all your time looking at the old stuff and trying to find it all and forklift that into new, or do you start with figure out what the business processes are and build out that new paradigm and work out of there? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that don't focus too much internally. Don't forget the third party side of it, because the reality of it is, I wouldn't say you can almost ignore the inside of it if you can solve for the third party side of it. But as John said, if you look at the number of attacks there are, they're absolutely rooted in AI identity, but primarily in third party and people attacking your supply chain through identity there. And then the third thing is driving automation around that to help you with compliance at a scaled, in a scaled way, because ultimately the number of identities, as you said, that we're going to grow towards in the coming years, automation is really the only way that we're going to be able to handle it. Managing things in a spreadsheet out of a compliance team isn't going to cut it. So there's going to have to be a different way of managing that. And I guess the final thing for me is don't get too hung up on the technology for now. There's other stuff to do around people and process first. The technology will complement that further down the road. But if you go and buy a tool and expect that to solve the whole problem, then that's not going to be the most successful of journeys for you.
Yeah, we see that a lot, don't we? Understand your business and the processes before you try and implement the technology that helps with them, I think. Okay, good stuff. Thanks very much for your time, guys. For all the listeners, I think we always like to leave with some real solid practical help. So we've got an offer where we'll do you a free of charge IGA program education workshop. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with us and we'll help you get through some of these practical steps and avoid some of the pitfalls we've been talking about today. So yeah, just finally, thanks again once more, Jonathan and Dave, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.